Over the past few weeks, we've been talking about 1 Corinthians 15, which is this long chapter by the Apostle Paul exploring the resurrection, not only the resurrection of Jesus, but also the idea of resurrection in the future. That's really the main thing that this chapter is about. We've looked at the first part of the chapter that talks about the gospel, which is the good news about King Jesus, who he is, what he's done, what he's doing right now, and what he will do in the future. And then the second section looked at what if there is no future resurrection? What if we can't look forward to a day when God makes all things new and God raises our bodies and raises the world in some physical but transformed way? And last week we looked at the idea that Jesus is king for a purpose, that his purpose as king is to destroy and defeat death, that he must put all things back into unity, back into harmony, in heaven and on earth, because God is a triune God and he designed creation to operate in a way that reflects who he is. So today we're going to look at one of the strangest parts of an already strange passage. 1 Corinthians 15 is complex because it's dealing with one of the most complicated topics that we could imagine, which is resurrection. And then in the middle of this passage, Paul uses some really odd arguments that have led to a lot of confusion. And so today we're just going to look at a short section of the passage, starting in verse 29. We're going to look at some of these different and weird ideas that Paul talks about. So let's check it out. I'll read it first from the New International Version. One of the challenges in this section is that all the translations translate things a little bit differently. So we'll start in the NIV. Now, if there is no resurrection, what will those do who are baptized for the dead? If the dead are not raised at all, why are people baptized for them? And as for us, why do we endanger ourselves every hour? I face death every day, yes, just as surely as I boast about you in Christ Jesus our Lord. If I fought with wild beasts in Ephesus, with no more than human hopes, what have I gained? If the dead are not raised, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. Do not be misled. Bad company corrupts good character. Come back to your senses as you ought, and stop sinning, for there are some who are ignorant of God. I say this to your shame. So Paul gives us a number of reasons to believe in the resurrection, and he's done so earlier in the passage. So he's coming back to that argument. There has to be a future resurrection for individuals and for the whole world, not only just the resurrection of Jesus. There has to be this in the future. And he gives us some reasons to believe in it. And he gives us some odd reasons in this passage, and some reasons that make sense but are confusing, and we're not sure exactly what he's getting at. But in the end, we'll see that he has a main point in this section that no matter what the arguments are or how strange they might seem to us, we can still understand his main point here. So let's look at some of the odd arguments first, and then in the end, we'll come to his main point, which is how do we live in light of this resurrection? So Paul writes in verse 29 first, now if there is no resurrection, what will those do who are baptized for the dead? If the dead are not raised at all, why are people baptized for them? This is an interesting passage, and there are certain groups of people who practice baptism for those who are dead, who they care about. Probably the most famous group is the Mormons. They believe that you can be baptized on behalf of a family member or ancestor or somebody else, and that through your baptism, then on their behalf, that person can be welcomed into heaven. And perhaps that's what was going on in Corinth, but this passage, either way, is not telling us what we should do. It's just telling us what people are doing. So what Paul's doing is a typical rabbinic argument. This is the typical type of argument of rabbis in the first century. Rabbis would take any and all arguments that bolster their case. And you can see this if you look at Paul's writings. Sometimes Paul will quote a passage to prove one thing, and sometimes he will quote a passage in the opposite way to prove sometimes the same thing, but he'll actually make the opposite point to prove the same point. It's really strange how he does that to us. But that's how rabbis would argue. Other times, Paul will quote a passage from the original Hebrew version of the text, and sometimes he'll quote it from the Greek version of the text to make a point. And that's the normal way that rabbis argued. To us, that feels like cheating in logic, but that's just how their logical system worked. So what Paul does here is he's referring to a practice that people participated in, baptism on behalf of the dead, and he's using it to bolster his case. He's not necessarily endorsing it. It says in the NIV, what will they do? Other translations just say, what are they doing? Why are these people doing this? If there's no resurrection, then why are they doing it? There's no point. And what Paul's point is here is, why are people being baptized on behalf of the dead if there's no resurrection? It's pointless. So what is baptism on behalf of the dead? Well, our first inclination is to think that people were being baptized so that a deceased family member or friend could be welcomed into heaven. That might be what's going on, or it could be something different. Another possibility, and some that certain biblical scholars really like, is that people knew friends who were Christians who died. And if your friend was a Christian, they died, and you really missed your friend, and you would hope that you could see your friend again, you might choose to follow Jesus with the hope that maybe Jesus would raise you and your friend so that you could see them again. And so that would be getting baptized personally on behalf of your dead friend who was a Christian. So that's perhaps what's going on here, that people are getting baptized in hopes that they will see their friend, but then those people would say, but there's no resurrection, that's a weird idea. And Paul's saying, well, then why are you doing any of this? The only reason you chose to follow Jesus was so that you would be able to see your friend when you're both dead. Now, that's not a great reason to be baptized, a great reason to start following Jesus, but it is the reason that I, as a 3-year-old, started to follow Jesus. My dad and I were talking, and my dad was talking about the return of Jesus and being with God forever. And I said, are you going to be with Jesus forever? And he said, yes. And as a 3-year-old, I was terrified that I would be alone without my parents. And so I chose as a 3-year-old to accept Christ. Now, obviously, my faith has grown from that, and there's more reason to follow Jesus today. But this idea of being baptized for the dead really resonates with me as a possibility, because it's basically why I chose to follow Jesus in the first place. And Paul's saying to people like me, hey, if you don't believe there's a resurrection, then your whole reason for starting on this journey doesn't make any sense. That could be what's going on here, but we just don't know what exactly baptism for the dead means. In any case, Paul is saying there's something going on that people are doing that would be nonsense if there's no resurrection in the future for the followers of Jesus. So Paul moves from that reason to believe in the resurrection to another reason to believe in the resurrection. He says, not only are those who are being baptized for the dead doing something that depends on the resurrection, my entire lifestyle only makes sense if there is a resurrection. So I'm going to read from N.T. Wright's translation what he has to say here, starting in verse 30. Paul says, and why should we face danger every hour? I die every day. Other translations say, I face death every day. Yes, that's something for you to boast about, my dear family. And that's the boast I have in the Messiah, Jesus our Lord. There are a whole lot of different ways to translate verse 31, and every translation I look at puts it a little bit differently. So let's look at the possibilities. Paul is saying, in all the translations, I'm facing death all the time. And he might be talking about his times he's been persecuted, that people have stoned him and beaten him, driven him out of cities. He might be talking about the way he's giving his life, that he's denying himself and choosing to serve others and to serve Jesus. He's probably talking about both. After that, he says, yes, indeed, that's what I do. In some translations, Paul says that's something for you to boast about. Other translations, Paul says, that's what I boast about, is that you are also doing this. So the way it's constructed in Greek, it's not really clear. In any case, what Paul is saying is that this lifestyle of giving your life, of sacrifice, is something that either Paul wants to boast about in them or that they boast about in him. Either way, Paul is saying the thing that we should be proud about as followers of Jesus is not our accomplishments, but what we've given up. It's a reverse kind of pride, that my pride is what I've lost, not what I've gained or what I've won. That's what Paul's getting at here. But Paul says that type of life, where it's about sacrifice, about losing your life, doesn't make sense unless there's resurrection for you and me. Jesus says, whoever wants to find their life must lose it. Jesus says, if anyone wants to be my disciple, you must deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. That's what it means to follow Jesus. And unfortunately, a lot of Christians today, and especially in our country, don't understand that this is the essence of following Jesus, that it greatly involves, that it at its center is the denial of yourself, is the following of Jesus by taking up the cross, by laying down your life. But that type of life doesn't make sense without resurrection. There are a lot of people in our world who do great things, who do positive things that make a difference in the world. There are a lot of people who do the right thing, who do the moral thing. And you could have other reasons to do nice things or to do moral things. besides the resurrection. You could have a lot of reasons to do those things. But there isn't a good reason to live the life that Jesus taught of denying yourself, of taking up the cross, of this type of life that is deeper than just doing what is good or what is right. There's not a lot of reason to live that life unless Jesus is raised from the dead and unless you know that you will be raised from the dead as well. So Paul says, I die every day, or I face death every day. And then in verse 32, he says, if in human terms I fought with wild animals at Ephesus, what use is that to me? Or in the NIV, if I fought with wild beasts in Ephesus with no more than human hopes, what have I gained? What's he talking about here? There are a number of possibilities. Perhaps Paul was captured for preaching about Jesus, and he was forced to fight as a gladiator in the ring. And there's some people who think that Paul may have been a gladiator. He had to face the lions. We read stories about Christians facing the lions in the centuries after this quite often. So it's possible, but pretty unlikely that that's what Paul's talking about. Why is it unlikely? Well, we don't read about Paul facing the lions or any other kind of wild beasts in Acts, and that seems like the kind of thing that would be mentioned. Also, Paul was a Roman citizen, and Roman citizens were not required to face the lions or other wild beasts for the entertainment of the masses. That was one of his rights, that he wouldn't have to do that. So most likely Paul is using a metaphor here, either to talk about him facing spiritual powers, and he's referring to them as wild beasts, or he's referring to human opponents as wild beasts in a metaphorical sense. But one thing really stood out to me when I was reading this passage earlier today. Why does Paul use the phrase wild beasts? Why doesn't he use some other metaphor? When we come to strange passages, we want to start making connections with other ideas in our world, other ideas we think about, the way we think about wild animals, or the way we think about the situations in our life that might be compared to a wild beast. But why does Paul make this comparison? When we approach the Bible, we need to think of it as a meditation book, that we are designed to read a passage at one point in our life, and then later in life, we come back to that same passage with what we know from other parts of the Bible. That when you read a section of the Bible, there are ideas that are connected to other places. Many of you know I'm a big fan of the work of the Bible Project, and they've done quite a bit on the idea that the Bible is Jewish meditation literature. And you can look up one of their videos here on YouTube about Jewish meditation literature to learn about that idea. One of the ideas that they talk about a lot is that the Bible is full of hyperlinks. What does that mean? Well, when you go on a website, you can link from one page to another in many different ways. It's not like a book where it's just sequential. Most of our Western books are chronological and sequential. But now in the digital era, in the digital age, we have websites that have links multiple directions. And that's the way the Bible is designed. It's not just a chronological book. There are ideas that are in one page that link to ideas on many other pages. I'm the kind of person that will go on Wikipedia and I can get lost for hours. I will just go down these crazy wormholes of idea to idea to idea to idea that you might say, how did you get there? Well, it makes sense to me. And that's kind of how the Bible is too, that when you read an idea in one passage that calls to mind an idea in another passage, that's a journey you're meant to take. And so Paul is talking about these wild beasts that he contends with here, and it's probably metaphorical for spiritual or human opponents. But what is he referring to? What in the Bible does this call to mind? Well, when you go back to Genesis 1, God creates animals, including wild beasts. And he gives humans the responsibility to care for the wild beasts, to manage them, to bring them into order. When you read Genesis 1, it lays out all the different kinds of plants and animals and humans. And then in Genesis 2, the humans are given this responsibility to take this center place of Shalom, which is the Garden of Eden, and to make the whole world like that. Genesis 1 at the end, the commission given to humans is to fill the earth, to subdue it, to rule over all the plants, the animals, the wild beasts. And in Genesis 2, they're given one place that is already like that, which is Eden, sort of as a foothold, a place to start from to make the whole world like that. So Paul, by talking about contending with wild beasts, is talking about a present creation reality, that our present creation is not in full harmony. Our interaction with nature is not fully harmonious. And that includes our interaction with actual, literal wild beasts, but also our interactions with each other. We are not in full harmony with one another, and it also includes our interactions with the spiritual world. We are not in full harmony with the spiritual world. All of these things are broken. So when I read the words wild beasts, it calls to mind Genesis 1. It causes me to meditate on this idea that things are not the way they're supposed to be. They're not the way they're meant to be. And I think that's part of what Paul is getting at here and why he chose to refer to his opponents as wild beasts, is to help us realize that this present creation that we live in is imperfect and there is contention. But the new creation that God is establishing and will establish does not have any of that contention. Instead, it has harmonious coexistence that mirrors the Trinity. So if we have contention with other people or spiritually or even with nature, that should remind us of the fact that we have hope that things will be changed, that things will be transformed, and that ultimately God will reconcile all things into peace, into shalom. So Paul says, if I contended with these wild beasts, and all I have is present creation hope that I might win, man, that's not a great kind of hope. But instead, if I do have this new creation hope that God will restore all things, that he'll bring humans, animals, spiritual things all into harmony, then I have great reason for hope. The next thing Paul says in this section goes back to his conversation about the Epicureans earlier in the chapter. To refresh our memory about the Epicureans, they followed the philosophy of Epicurus, who lived about 300 BC. And Epicurus believed that we couldn't access the gods, that they're so far away, and so we shouldn't be so concerned with superstition and that sort of thing. Instead, we should try to live a life of pleasure, and the chief way to achieve a life of pleasure is by avoiding pain. So we should not take on the needs of other people, and instead we should just focus on our own bodily pleasure. Likely in Corinth, there were a number of people following this philosophy, and most likely there were a lot of people in the church of Corinth who wanted to live in this way. So Paul summarizes the teaching of the Epicureans, and he's maybe exaggerating it a little bit with this quote from Isaiah. Paul says, if the dead are not raised, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. He says, look, if there's no resurrection for us in the future, then life is meaningless. Let's just party. Who cares about our families? Who cares about our friends or anybody else in our society? Let's just only care about ourselves. So the implied contrast there is that if there is a resurrection, not only for Jesus, but for us, then we have great reason to live in a very different way. And that's exactly what Paul goes into next in verse 33. He says, do not be misled. Bad company corrupts good character. Come back to your senses as you ought and stop sinning. For there are some who are ignorant of God. I say this to your shame. Paul says you've been around people who are living in this way of just thinking of themselves and their current pleasure, and they're not thinking long term, not only for what's good for you in the long run in a few years, but they're not thinking long term with an eternal perspective that God is going to restore all things and make all things right, and that means that I live in a different way now. And you've allowed the thinking of the Epicureans and others to influence how you're living today. This is not chiefly a passage about morality, a passage that is telling us, do the right thing. What Paul is saying is, rather than do the right thing, Paul is saying, live in a way that lines up with the resurrection. And you could call that right. I've talked a lot about how a shelf is right and just. A shelf is flat, and it's therefore justified and upright. This shelf behind me may not look right or upright to you because I don't know how my camera angle is, but it is. It's vertical, it's horizontal. And then I have this other shelf over on my right. That's a weird shelf, and anyone who comes in my office is confused by it. So let me show it to you. So I have this strange shelf that is definitely not right or upright, and it's weird. It's an unrighteous shelf. It doesn't mean that it's immoral. It just means that it's not justified to the room. It's not lined up. And in the same way, if we believe that there's a resurrection of Jesus in our minds, but we live in a way that's just seeking our own pleasure, our own joy, or avoiding suffering, that doesn't line up with the reality of God's new creation. Paul is not primarily talking about a difference between a moral life and an immoral life. He is primarily talking about the difference between a life that lines up with a new creation reality instead of with a creation reality. The fact that he's just used the phrase wild beasts a few verses ago, And then in the next verses, he's going to begin to talk about different kinds of plants and animals. Gives us a hint that Paul is thinking about Genesis 1 and the idea that God created things in a certain way. And we'll see in a few minutes that when Paul writes to the Corinthians, he is thinking of the theme of creation and new creation. So what Paul is saying is live in a way that lines up with God's originally intended creation, not with the way creation is right now. Live in a way that lines up with new creation, not with the way creation is right now. Don't try to live a life that looks normal to our world. Try to live a life that looks normal to God's intent, that looks normal to the triune God of love. He says, do not be misled. Bad company corrupts good character. The people around you, if you try to live like them, it's corrupting you. It's not making you live the way that lines up with the resurrection. Come back to your senses as you ought and stop sinning. Sinning, when we hear the word sin, we automatically go to moral categories. What do I need to do to make sure I'm not sinning? If I do this, is that sin? Is that okay or not? Sin means missing the mark. In both Hebrew and Greek, it's an archery term for not being exactly true to who you were meant to be, for not hitting the mark, for not hitting the bullseye. That's not, first and foremost, a moral category. First and foremost, it means not being the image bearer of God that you were designed to be. God intended you to look like God, and God is love. God intended you to be love, but we're not all the time. So stop sinning. Stop continuing to live in a way that looks out for me instead of looking out for the people around me. Come back to your senses as you ought and stop sinning. He's saying, don't live like the Epicureans who say, I'm not going to care about others because that's going to bring pain into my life. No, instead be a person of love, and being a person of love means caring about others, and yes, that does mean bringing pain into your life. But that kind of life makes sense if there's a resurrection. Paul says there are some who are ignorant of God. And what he's talking about is there are some of you Christians who are not remembering God when you think about how you live every day. You might be coming to church, you might be talking about God at certain times, but your everyday life is largely ignorant of God. You're forgetting about God and how you're living, how you're interacting with your neighbors and friends. Everything you do ought to be informed by the resurrection of Jesus and by the future resurrection hope that you have, that new creation is coming. We know that Paul is thinking about the theme of creation and new creation when he writes in 1 Corinthians 15 because of the things he said about wild beasts and what he says in the next few verses about plants and animals having specific kinds of bodies. But it's even more clear that he's thinking about this theme when we get to 2 Corinthians. Paul wrote this first letter to the Corinthians because there were some things they needed to change. And they changed some of them, but not all of them. So Paul sent more letters to them. And one of the other letters that Paul wrote to them is preserved in our Bibles as 2 Corinthians. And we're going to look at 2 Corinthians 5, which ties in very closely to 1 Corinthians 15. In fact, this is the first of two times that we're going to see how 2 Corinthians 5 ties in with 1 Corinthians 15. We're going to look at one of the more well-known and famous passages in the whole Bible, 2 Corinthians 5:17. That's the passage that says, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old is gone, the new is here. Or in some translations, it says, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. 2 Corinthians 5:16, Paul says, so from now on, we regard no one from a worldly point of view. We don't think about anyone in a present creation way. What 2 Corinthians 5:16 really says is that from now on, we no longer regard anyone from the perspective of the flesh. So you could think of that like we no longer regard anyone from a human perspective or a merely human perspective, the way we usually view others as human beings, which is I'm the main character of my story and everybody around me is just a minor character or an extra in my story. They don't really matter that much. That's the way that we view others. That's the way we view the world. But in contrast to that, what Paul writes in Greek is even more stunning than it can be captured in English. He starts an if-then statement. He says, if anyone is in the Messiah, and then he interrupts it with this phrase, new creation. If anyone is in the Messiah, new creation. And so neither of the ways that we usually see this phrase translated in our Bibles can fully capture that. I don't think that we can really capture this in a written way. But since we're on a video, let's do our best to try to capture what Paul is trying to say via video. He says, from now on, we don't just view others the normal human way. We don't just see others in this black and white sense of I'm the main character and you're all the extras. No, if anyone is in the Messiah, new creation. The old is gone, the new is here. What that passage really is talking about is that if you are in the Messiah, if you are connected to Jesus, then the whole new creation reality of the resurrection is embodied in you. That you as an individual look like the new creation, and that not only you as an individual look like the new creation, but that whole new creation reality is somehow mystically present within you, and that you can live in a way that lines up with that instead of lining up with the present world. All this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through the Messiah and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. What is reconciliation? Reconciliation is making peace between two parties that are at odds. God has reconciled us to himself. He's brought us into peace with God. And he's given us the ministry of reconciliation. What does that mean? Well, first it means to make other people reconcile with God, to help them know God. And I think for a lot of us, we think that's primarily what the ministry of reconciliation is. But let's stop and think about what reconciliation really means. Reconciliation means making peace. In Matthew 5, in the Beatitudes, Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers." But when we think about peace, we need to go back to that word we always go back to, shalom. Peacemaking and reconciliation are all about making shalom. And making shalom is more than just giving people inner peace or peace with God. It involves making peace in every way, bringing the harmony that God intended for creation into being in the present. Making shalom means making right of bad relationships. Making shalom means restoring relationships between me and you or between two other people with one another. Making shalom means helping other people to know God. Making shalom means changing how we interact with nature, with creation. All of that is part of being a minister of reconciliation. And that's pretty evident from what Paul says in the next few verses. All of this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through the Messiah and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. That God was reconciling the world to himself in the Messiah, not counting people's sins against them. And he has committed to us the message of reconciliation. God isn't just reconciling naughty, immoral sinners to himself. God is reconciling all the world to himself, and that includes our sin, the ways in which we've missed the mark. We are therefore Christ's ambassadors. We are therefore the ambassadors of the King, as though God were making his appeal through us. We implore you on the Messiah's behalf, be reconciled to God. Find shalom with God. Come into that harmonious relationship with God and with all of the things that belong to God, which is everything. So Paul is saying, no longer live in a way that lines up with the present creation, with the world. Instead, live in a way that lines up with new creation, where everything is full of harmony, where everything is full of shalom. That's what he's saying here in 2 Corinthians 5. And in 1 Corinthians 15, he's saying, look, if you're going to live in a way that lines up with new creation, then you have to believe intellectually in the resurrection, or it doesn't make any sense. They go hand in hand. How we think and how we live. So I encourage you, I implore you, on behalf of the Messiah, be reconciled to God. Come into a harmonious relationship with God. And as you do that, be a minister of reconciliation. To be a minister just means to serve others. It doesn't mean to be a pastor or anything like that. Ministry just means service. Serve others by helping them come into peace. And you can do this in so many ways. You can help other people to know God. You can help other people live at peace with others. You can bring people into shalom with nature, with the created world. Anytime you make anything beautiful or abundant, you are bringing shalom to the world around you. And so I encourage you to be a minister of reconciliation and to come into peace with God.